We're on cue. So, good evening, everybody. Good to see you this evening. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, or page 13 in your books, if you have that. Does anybody need a copy of tonight's lesson? We do got some copies left if you need one. So, let me see, Willie, can you grab some copies and raise your hands if you need a copy? We get copies to you. I got one here that I can send over. You got it? Okay. He's got it. Thank you, guys. So before we get started tonight, we're going to ask Robbie to lead us in prayer, and then we'll dive right in. So go ahead, Robbie.
Dear God and Father in heaven, we approach your throne this evening, so thankful for another day. And Lord, especially for this opportunity at the end of the day, but in the middle of a week, to take a break and to study your word and to spend some time with our brothers and sisters in Christ, being edified by one another and hopefully divining some wisdom from your holy word, Lord. Please be with the study tonight. Please bless us with development and new knowledge, and Lord, help us to apply it to our lives. We ask that you please be with us as we leave this place, that we would continue to think on these things and to dwell on your word, so at the next appointed time we can once again edify one another and build each other up in your word. Lord, we thank you above all things for sending your Son to come to this earth and die on the cross to be our Savior. It's in his most holy and precious name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Robbie. Appreciate that. So again, we're in chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, and we talked a little bit about what are we reading and what are we looking at, and we've been looking at through the lens of Solomon. And we've all had different ways to look at that. One of the things I'm looking at is kind of like somebody, a professor or somebody, an engineer, looking to try to figure out a solution. So they go to a blackboard and they're starting to think about all those different things. But then we're looking at just life under the sun. And so it leaves out an important part of things, but still it's very important to it. We talked about this book being very timely still today, even though it was written 3,000 years ago. It wasn't written to the children of Israel, it was written to men. So a little difference. We see some of the books that were written to the children of Israel, but this is an instructional book just to men in general. So it has the struggle of man, it has the search for what is important is. It has, to try to find out our purpose in life. It has for the search of the meaning of life. And then it has the conclusions on those things too. So Solomon talking about this material universe and then going through, and this is not a step-by-step experiment. He's not doing these going along and then doing one and writing something, doing one and writing something. He's already done all this. He's had the resources to do these things. He's had the will to do these things. And so he when he's writing to us and we're getting this, he knew the outcome from the very beginning. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2 says, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So right at the beginning he tells us that, right from the very start. And then at the end in 12:13 he knows the conclusion already. When it's all been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. So we see him introducing the book. We go through chapter 2. He's doing all these different various experiments, trying to find out these meanings, this purpose. He goes through pleasure. He goes through self-indulgence, success, wealth, possessions, his works, all these things that he was able to do. He even went down the path more of wisdom and of folly, madness. Found out really what's that matter, because at the end both of them die, looking at those. Goes into labor and toils. He's going into all these different things, and he's coming up that all of it is vanity. None of it has purpose. And so now in chapter 3, he's going to look at this question of what's the meaning of life, what's these purposes, in a time construct, adding time to the picture here and looking at those things too. So We looked a little bit last week about, we started in here just looking, examining what time is. And time kind of can be defined several different ways, but a measured period in which events occur is how we're looking at it and looking at that. And it's in a context here of what is a person's life living out? What is that time frame of life living out? And we saw Benjamin Franklin said this is stuff of which life is made. And we talked about a couple facts about him. Everyone has the same amount of time, literally 24 hours in a day, different ages, different people live longer than others. We see that. The oldest person in the world, known person in the world, died today, I guess, 118 years old. So some nun in France. But we know that there's a beginning and an end to our lives, and we have the same time in a day. And our lives continually now revolve around it. We see that just by, we've got 40 minutes in this class to be able to go through. We have church on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings. We have calendars, we have work hours, we have all these different things that we tie our schedules to. So, we are the only creature able to conceptualize and use time effectively to our advantage. So time can be both a limitation and it can also be an opportunity. And we know how to use that. Now, the animals know seasons of time. They might know when to hibernate and those things, but actually being conscious of how to use that time, we are one of the only creatures about it. So why is time important? We looked at that a little bit. It's rare. It's irretrievable. Once it's gone forever. You can't stop time. You can't go back in time. It's what we have now. It's what we can work with now, but once it's gone, we're never getting it back. And because it's fleeting, we see James 4:14 talks about life being like a vapor. We know that we're born and we know we die. We know we have this amount of time, and even 118 years. This book was written 3,000 years ago. That's not a lot of time in the big picture. And so, most of these things we look at time and going through those. And we talked just on a sidetrack. Andrew kind of made a point of this in his lesson on Sunday. But using your time, if you only use your time for God or for service to God by coming to church, you're here in the pews every time the door's open. That's only 2% of the time you have in a week. Not very much, right? Andrew talked about time that being spent to where a lot of time spent on social media, a lot of time on TV, a lot of time, and those things could be up to 4 to 6 hours a day. That's the average in the U.S. So that's almost 33% of your time. Again, so if you're looking at doing all that every day, 33%, you're looking at 2%. If this is all you're getting, it's where's our priorities for our time? What are we doing and what are we thinking about that? We talked about it only takes 30 minutes to read the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Less than 3 minutes to read this chapter. Did you spend that time? Those are things that we need to be looking at and just thinking about, because there's so many time bandits that can grab us everywhere we go. They can grab us and take away from our time. There's just all these different things on the list. It's just we just got to figure out what our priority is, looking at those things and what can we do. Like I say, it can be a limitation or it can be an opportunity. We want to find ways to use more of our time for God. We're going to look at a couple timeline charts, how we look at periods of time as we get into some of these other periods of times. But, venture to say, and I heard this by one of the other people, and you all heard this before too, when the time has come to where we're on our deathbed or know that our death is imminent, we're not going to look back and say, did we get that last Facebook post on? Did we spend more time at the office? We're not going to look at those kind of time things and say we should have done more of that. We're going to be focusing on other things. Most likely preparation for the Lord, to be able to meet the Lord, but also family, on those things that are much higher priorities than what we can have it. But we have to be looking at opportunities where we can spend more time with God too, and we kind of put a plug in for house to house. We kind of put a plug in for the reading every day, doing more the podcast, for example. Matter of fact, Psalm 73, our podcast this morning, talked a little bit about Asaph having the frustrations of seeing the inequities in life. We're going to see that a little bit more with Solomon and some of his cynicism going up and back and forth. But it's not just there. It's not just with Solomon. It's not just earlier times, but also with our times too. Matthew 6:33, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble on its own. Again, we need to look at how we can put more things in our life that would surround us with opportunity to spend more time with God and with each other. As Robbie said, encouraging each other, edifying each other and everything. Because once time's gone, it's never coming back. Whoops, I was on the wrong slide there. So, Steve, go ahead.
So I was told one time that you're never going to live long enough to make all the mistakes yourself. So you have to learn from other people's mistakes. Yeah. And I'm thinking, with Solomon, we have the opportunity to really learn something because he had the ability and the wherewithal to make a lot of mistakes, and he was able to overcome a lot of those things. Some of them he wasn't, maybe, but if we learned from the wisdom that he puts in this book, well, we would save ourselves a lot of time.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Somebody made that point last week too, as far as we don't have to put our hand on that stove to find out. And Solomon goes through all of these things. We'll see that coming through too. You've probably seen this before. This is kind of those of you in different marketing or business and different things. Stephen Covey, highly effective people, efficiency guru, just does this little activity, which is basically the same amount of materials are laid out, stone, rock, sand, different sizes, different shapes, all identical, one jar to the other. And the point is, put them all in. And the concept here is, to make this thing really work where you can get the lid back on the jar, you have to put in the big rocks first. It's not something just willy-nilly throwing it all together, because you'll never get the lid on, as you'll see in the one side, over here. You never get the lid on. But if you put the big rocks in first, kind of prioritize those, makes those priorities, then it becomes able to get those things together on that. So you don't find time for important things. If you think about your life right now, what's important to you and just different things, you make time for those things. It's not that you have to find time for those things, because you're going to make the time for them. Your schedule, the rest of your schedule is going to go around those things. So we just got to be able to look and reevaluate what are our priorities and then set them accordingly. So looking at those things, just a few more things on follow-up from last week. As we look at periods of life, this might be hard to see, I don't know if you can tell or not, but we kind of segment things almost into decades, and now we might look at this for our children or grandchildren, what they're, the pinnacles of points of different things that happen within our life. It's up through the 20s, the college years and legal adulthood, jobs, and then more serious about our relationships, and then later on children, buying a home, getting those things squared away, and then going on further, we see, the different areas of the different things we're juggling along the way, later on into retirement, those type of planning, and then going on even further. We get so busy sometimes, we get lost in time. In any one of these decades or any one of these things, as we look at periods of times, how we mark time in some of those things by our timeline, we just got to watch the traps, right? We got to be able to stay focused, because it's a hustle. It's hard, in this life, juggling some of the different schedules that we have and some of the things that we make. Matter of fact, I don't know if you noticed on that time wasters, sometimes it's important just to say no, be able to say no, because you can spread yourself out so thin by taking on so many different things, you can leave some other things off and everything. So once time it's gone, you can't get it back. There's a saying, it says, yesterday's the past, tomorrow's the future, but today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. So, what do we do now? What are we looking at now? As we see here coming up, eternity is endless, but our time is going to be measured by the beginning and the end, the dash as we called. And we know in Genesis chapter 1, we know in the beginning, right? That was the beginning of time. That's when we see. We know that time will end when Jesus comes back again, but we're here in the middle part too. So Going to the text in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, there is an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. So again, we're talking about how time is. We're talking about the cyclical nature of the events in life that we see that come upon us in this life under the sun. We see later on these opposite, these pairs of, a time to give birth and a time to die, all the different, those things. We're seeing an opposites that really are more reflecting this range, these things that are, trying to encompass everything there would be in life from one end to another. That's a little bit of a poetic device called Maryism, and we see that in several other places in the Bible too. But it's told that we want to look at these ranges for what the total experience of life is. And the sum total of all these does not make up the whole meaning of life. All the different things that we could do, all the things that we did have and the different experiences, all of it together still does not teach us really what life is all about. So, Bill?
Yeah, as I was reading through this, it caused me to reflect on how I am. And I don't think I'm totally unique in every way, but when I'm having a good time, I don't want it to stop. When things are going well at work, I expect it to keep going. When financially the economy's doing great, I want it to keep moving that way because I'm going to watch and plan everything as if everything's going to keep increasing. And when I read this, it's like a slap in the face to say, wake up. Life is not about the good times, nor is life about the bad times. Life is realizing that everything's transitory. Everything you see in front of you, God has a window for everything. Don't expect it to stay because that's not why he's put you here. And it's not like Solomon all of a sudden gives me the answer for why God put me here in this chapter. But I think he's trying to jar us and let us know not so much how are you going to prioritize your days, but don't expect that life revolves around what you're planning. Because you may be wanting to build something, but tomorrow something's going to come, maybe a hurricane will come and tear it down. And just learn to accept where you're at, learn to appreciate the good God's given you, and in some ways roll with it. Just learn to just accept it.
Well, he's going to say, accept your lot in life. We're going to see that in just a couple minutes too. But yeah, no, it is this cyclical nature of things that we're going through that aren't going to be. We're not always going to be on a high and then always be on a low. There's going to be things that come through us. So as we look at these things, we look at just a quick, fast overview of these because we started on some of these last week. But it starts off, life and death. We're born and we die. And everything in between is kind of caught up in here. Each one of these areas you can kind of take back and look at how some of those things are a little bit more of tied into some of their society and some of the different things. If you wanted to get really granular in these areas, when we think of a time to kill and time to heal, that might shock us. But you got to remember, you're talking to those people that had the ability to avenge a death. And there were cities of refuge to protect people from getting death. So in some cases, they were gonna kill in some of those areas, let alone the time to throw stones and time to gather stones, for example. We see several times there's examples of them scattering stones in their enemies' fields and stuff to keep them from growing their crops and everything. And sometimes they had to gather them out of their own fields because of that happening for different things they had too. So you've got all these different really events that we see in all the way through these things. And it's just really trying to tell us, it's two pairs of 7. There's 14 of these, 7 being a complete number. That's another thing in here. This is just the cycles of life. These are the things that are happening. These are complete from one end to another. You're going to see these things. And so, as Bill was saying, what's the message? Huh? What's the message? Hold on to the lap bar, right? Come on, Willie, come on down here, please. It's a roller coaster ride. There are ups and downs. There's curves everywhere. There's slow times, and then it comes at you fast. throws you side to side. There's a feeling you might fall out. One moment you're scared to death, white knuckling it, and the next time you're just elated, kind of deal. Make you feel sick, and other times you're in line to go do it again, right? I mean, that's cycles of life we go through. Those are things that we're going to see in these season events of life. So, Mark?
Yeah, if you're an unbeliever, this should just scare you, because this is up ahead. There's not enough of you to deal with this on your own, or even with human help. If you don't have God, this is going to sink you. For the believer, I think the realization is God has my back. So I know there's a reason that things happen, but also I think you're going to find yourself not wanting to do what the season is. There's a time that you have to sever fellowship, like in the verse. I might not want to do that, but it has to be done, or there's the peace-loving nation has to prepare for war. Well, we don't want to do that, but that's reality. And so I think it's important that don't go by your feeling. You got to do the right thing. You got to do the will of God, but don't try to buck the season. Don't try to rejoice when it's a time of mourning.
Yeah, there's a lot to those things, and every one of those things we can pull some of those out of. I think Solomon's point in general on all these things is looking at time constructed the way we look at it under the sun. No matter what happens, it's there's going to be rich people that do evil. There's going to be good people that get poor. There's things that happen. All these different events that are around there, that all these experiments that he sees. It's meaningless. It's just not so sure of what's next, on those things. Because again, like Mark said, looking past that, which we have the privilege and to be able to do that by having the written word revealed to us. But Solomon's looking at these experiments this way, across the board. Matter of fact, I got a slide coming through talking about the horizontal and the vertical. He's looking at all these things, and like I said, it's so sad when some people that live in this life try to live it without God. They live it on their own, expecting there to be some sort of great purpose in life, some sort of how do you hang on? You know what I mean? It's just, if you didn't have God, we've been there 100 different times, and we've seen loss of life, we've seen sickness, we've seen different things. How could we do that if we didn't have the promise of eternal life? It's so hard to even think of, but yet there's a massive world out there that's living that every day, that could care less, that this is what they got. The one who has the most toys in the ends wins. It's just a completely different concept. And Solomon's saying, like Steve said, he's done this. He's had the experience to do this. He's went to the depths of all these different areas, and he's saying, doesn't make sense. It's not worth it. It's vanity. It's not looking at those things. So let's keep going on the text here a little bit. So he asked the question in verse 9, what profit is there to the worker that is which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even till the end. So what's the profit? It's the question he's asking. What do people really get for all their work? Okay, nothing, right? Nothing without God. Zero, right? At the end of the day, because the rich, the ones who got the rich that got their things, and the poor, they both died in the end. The wise guy and the fool, they both died in the end. They didn't get anything out of it. There is no profit. The sum total of all men's experience measured in his or her lifetime is just a cycle common to all people. Everyone lives and dies. Everyone loves and hates. Every generation, everyone has had those experiences. And it means nothing if you don't have God. So what's the purpose? Where's life going? Solomon observed all this and left this big thing. It can only be found beyond man's experience, right? It's not going to be found here. It's got to be on man's point of view, something that has to look past the sun to look at that. Time only makes sense when considered in a divine context, not a human one. It only makes sense when we put it within an eternal time frame. And it says here that there's been eternity set in his heart. So, so looking there a little bit more here, I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. So, so it's okay to enjoy the nice things in life? What's Solomon saying here? It's a gift, right? It's a gift to be able to enjoy those things in life. Now, do we have an Old Testament versus New Testament? Is it something that we in the Old Testament we could enjoy it, but the New Testament we can't?
I think the word do good is important there too. He's not saying
Willie.
for yourself. And also he's already said,
Hold on one second, Mark. Let's get you on the mic. Thank you.
he's already said, I think one of the most important phrases in the book, you've got eternity in your heart. And that's Genesis 1, made in God's image. Animals immersed in time. You're not, or you shouldn't be immersed in time. You can have a sense of the past, the present, and the future, and kind of a sense of eternity. But he said earlier in the book that, but if you don't have God, you can't appreciate, if God's not your ultimate good, you have no way to evaluate anything below that. You have no way to put like a value on anything else, including you, your mate, children, etc. So it's the only way that you can appreciate what you have and understand like the importance of what you're doing is you know you're doing the right thing.
Well, and that gets us back to looking at the perspective of where we're at, right? Solomon's talking about all these things on the horizontal line. He's looking at life under the sun. These things it gives us no hope. It has no meaning. But he brings God into the picture, the eternity that's set in man's heart, made after his own image. We see it makes sense if we go to that vertical view. And that's some of the things we have to look at. Because quite frankly, when we look at these things like we talked about, it brings about, when we look at just the horizontal, it breeds cynicism. Cynicism is just one step away from hopelessness, which is hopelessness is despair. If we don't have God and we see that all these things in this life, cyclical in nature, we go the highs and we go the lows, we have the losses, we learn all these things, it's depressing. No wonder we can get jaded. We see around us, there's no justice, there's corruption, there's systemic corruption, all around us on there. Life's not always ends with a happy ending. The bad guy does win. Sickness happens. Wicked can have a happy life. It's the same today when looking at this life. It's pretty brutal at times. That can be very discouraging to a lot of people. That could be a lot of people that say, well, I can't believe there's a God because of these things that are happening. Well, that's not necessarily God's fault. I mean, they're happening because of Genesis 3. God created a perfect world, but then sin entered through mankind's helping it to enter, and now we're living in this fallen world. Tim, go ahead.
I think one of the big picture things in the New Testament is obtaining the peace that passes understanding. Promises in Philippians, if you do these things, God will be with you. But a pretty specific passage is 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So God knows if no one else does.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's like I say, we've got the privilege of being able to know these things basically from after the point where Solomon's like trying to get us to look through. And again, it's been mentioned earlier, this book can be an evangelistic book. It can give hope to those without hope that don't look at it, in those ways. It can get meaning to some of those people that are suffering to understand that it's not about this life. It's about the vertical that goes on with God. You got something, Willie? Did I miss one?
Yeah, when I read all this from Solomon, even when I hear him mention God's name, I see him still trying to figure things out without faith. The book of James says, you believe in God, you do well, the demons believe also and tremble. I see Solomon, he's a very smart man. He's not foolish enough to say there is no God. He knows there's a creator. but he's trying to figure out
He's
life.
talked to him. He's been
Yeah,
interacted with him. So
He's
yeah.
trying to figure out life kind of on his own with what he can see. And when you do that, what I read is it's like you're living in a dystopian novel. It's like you're living in the Truman Story, you know, if you've seen that movie where, okay, you know there's got to be something outside of what you're seeing, but you can't figure it out. And every time you get close, it's like something happens to shut you off and block your path. And that's how I see Solomon right now, is he's like, I'm almost looking behind the curtain, but once I do, something throws me far away so I can't look there anymore.
Yeah.
And again, it's this idea that without faith, you can't put it all together. Because what there is behind the curtain, we have to accept by God's revelation. And there's no way for any human to piece it together and figure it out.
Well, it's like Solomon right now is on his own roller coaster through this chapter, because we're going to look now that after he has this horizontal kind of depressing message all the way across, he brings this vertical viewpoint in, and he has this moment of clarity, this moment of insight. Verse 11 there, God makes everything beautiful, everything appropriate in his time. It's only God can give us that perspective. It's only him that puts those missing pieces of the puzzles together, like we're talking about there. Like Mark mentioned a minute ago, he put eternity in our heart. You know, he gives us that ability to know that inside this world, you know, it doesn't have that meaning. It's only when we add a part outside of time, as we know, the restriction of time as we know, that it starts to make sense. And that's God who put everything in purpose and put in place. We see that God also has given us ability to enjoy life. We talked about that a minute ago. Just even the simple pleasure of eating and drinking is a blessing from his hand. Verse there in 1 Timothy 6:17 is, don't focus on riches, but on God who richly supplies you with all things. You know, those are promises that we have. And we see that God's work is permanent. We kind of will never understand the totality of what God has done, the totality of how perfection he has made this world. It's just amazing to see that. His work is complete. You know, he didn't make anything shoddy. He didn't make anything superficial. It's just made with incredible. We had a meeting not too long ago with Buddy talking about, you know, the what do you call it? The micro machines, the design that we saw, you know, that we see in everything, all the way down to the smallest, you know, cell. It's just incredible, the design that's been put there. And we see that these cycles of life continue to go over again. You know, we see that his work is repetitive, the same cycles of life that can be going through. I was sitting today out a little bit early, and I kind of was watching the sun come up over the lake there, hearing the birds singing. You know, that's the way it is. I mean, every day you pretty much, unless it's overcast, or you're going to see that cycle of the sun. We're going to see those stars out in a permanent way that we can map it and chart it and be able to understand it, because it's perfect. It's those perfections, and all that gives him, you know, glory and shows the handiworks of the glory that he has. You know, just amazing to me as we see some of these things, and Solomon kind of starts pointing these things out. Also, when he's looking at when he's talking about God looking at his works permanent, that we'll never understand it. I can't help looking at Job when Job was starting to kind of say, hey, some things with God, and kind of questioning some things with God. God says to Job in Job 38:2, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins, because I'm going to ask you some questions now. Wouldn't that be something? You're sitting there thinking, like sometimes we do, that we know more than what God is, that we know what his totality is. And then he calls us out and says, okay, yeah, you're speaking without knowledge, and now you better tighten up, because I'm going to ask you some questions. You know, that's a pretty thing. We can't even imagine the fullness of what God has done for us. It's just very hard to understand there. Tim.
I was thinking a little further ahead here in Ecclesiastes 7, connected to God makes everything beautiful in his time. 7:2, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. So that's just another situation or example of looking at the bigger picture than what's right before us. It's pretty sad if you go to a funeral where there's no believers there. it's about their lives and it's good. You know, there's, you know, she was a giving person, that kind of thing. But the wise person who has God always in their mind lays it to heart, and my day will come. So, like you said, I need to prepare now. What's going to be in my mind at my deathbed? Have I served God? Am I ready? So those big picture things have to happen.
Yeah. And Solomon's showing that insight right here about this interjection into this whole text. We look at, if we look here in next text starting at 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and they'll return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better than a man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what occurs after him? So again, now we kind of go back and we step over to a cynical Solomon again. You got someone? Go ahead. Oh, sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
I look at it's kind of a weird point of view, but I look at Solomon as being gifted with a superpower. You know, if you were given a superpower, what would you do with it? You know, if you had strength, what would you do with that strength? But with him, he was given wisdom, but yet he's still a human. He's still just like you and I, like all of us. We have our own desires and all that kind of stuff. And so he took that and tried to apply the wisdom that he was given to find out the meaning of life. And we're witnessing what he, you know, came about in his looking at all these different things. And I think it's kind of interesting too that, you know, when he sees all these injustices and the righteous suffering or the oppressed, that he doesn't say, well, if there really was a God, that he wouldn't let that happen, which is what we hear a lot of times nowadays. And so he tells us, just from an earthly point of view, how, you know, much it's vanity this life is. And the question of, you know, what makes us different than the animals, what you were just saying there, is that God put eternity in our life, into our hearts. Well, what does that mean? That means a longing for a life that doesn't end. It's a longing for looking at where we came from, what was our grandparents like, our great-grandparents, what will our children be like after us? It's that longing to live and to have some meaning in life. And Solomon, he took what he knew from his father and what he was passed on to him, but we have even a greater wisdom today than what Solomon had when we see the full message that's been revealed to us in the gospel. And so that's a message that he didn't really understand, how much God loved us, and he recognized in this broken world that is so unjust what he was going to do to rectify that. Right. And Solomon's point of view is even more veiled than ours is, and we can really learn from both of those things.
Yeah, we have the vertical view, like you say. Thank God for that we do have that revelation to us. You know, and because you say with Solomon going back and forth here, he brings in God, the eternity in man's heart, the things of there, but then he comes back again here to this injustice that you kind of brought up too, that it's not always comfortable and it's not always fair. It's something that we're not going to get those things here in this life, but relief is coming. You know, Solomon tells us relief is going to be coming here. Injustices will get judged even then. So what's the use? You know, some of the things, you know, we don't want to try to necessarily don't try to understand the why of things that happen. Sometimes we can't understand the why of things happen. There was design put in, and so that way that God designed this world, so some of these things we won't have the knowledge of why things happen. So it's interesting when he uses these animals and looks at these things too. I couldn't help think of, dog eat dog, the world there, how it's going to go. And when he asks the question, who knows the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast ascends downward, no one knows that except with revelation from the Creator. And God tells us that. You act like an animal, you'll die like an animal, but you'll be judged as a human. That's kind of some of the message there. Will, you want to bring the mic down here, please? So he's looking at those things, and he kind of says, accept your lot, adjust your attitude, kind of make sure that you may not be able to alter your lot in life, but you sure can change your response to that. So he's telling us, you get one life, make it count, that choice is yours. So Mark?
A lot of people say, oh, I'm bothered by the injustice in the world. Why? Well, it's not right. Why? Is that your opinion? Is that a feeling? Or is it truly not right? And at that moment, one of the best things that could ever happen to you is injustice or pain, because it wakes you up. The presence of evil wakes you up, and you go like, all right, that's evil. But that brings you back to the counterpoint. Then there has to be good, and there has to be God. And I really like this section. I like that statement that God gets what passes by. Because to me, that says, all right, you see injustice, but heads up, no one's going to get away with anything.
Right.
At the end, God comes through and ties up all the loose ends. And I think for the believer, yeah, that's comforting. I don't have to go out and take my own revenge.
Right.
Let's try to save people, but if people are not going to repent, God's going to deal with it.
Yeah, this injustice is going to be temporary, right? There's going to be an eternal judgment that's coming. Let's see if we can get through a couple questions real quick and finish this out. Some of these we already talked about, but this one here, if you've looked about that, talked about the boy that was called out but probably was safe. So he's pouting over it and everything else. Finally, the coach calls him aside and says, I agree you were safe. Then he added, I also agree that it isn't fair, but life isn't fair, right? I mean, that's just, so how's he going to deal with that going through the rest of his life? That little boy from that time learning that all the way up. It's just part of it, right? We're going to see that in multiplicity of things, right? What should he said there? My coach probably would have said, suck it up, kind of deal. Get over it. Jan would have told me probably say, move past it, kind of deal. There's other things that could be done on there. Again, changing that attitude on those things too. So what about, we've talked about that one there. And on question 3, I think. So he has made everything beautiful in his time. Compare Romans 8:28 with the story of Job and Joseph and discuss how God caused them to rise above evil. Did Job or Joseph do anything that brought their trials upon them? Not that we know of. Joseph might have been a little cocky when he was a younger kid or something. I don't know if that's reason to kind of sell him into slavery and those things. But no, but they had these things that we saw God had a plan for them. So we don't know what God's providence always is. We don't know what that's going to mean in our life. And if nothing changes in our life, it still doesn't change the fact that this is the horizontal. We're pushing to the vertical. That's where we want to be. This life is a test. It's temporary. It's not something that we want to dwell on or let this thing defeat us. So again, we've got to look at that vertical standpoint on that. So what gift of God does Solomon see? Almost sounds a little bit like what the rich fool was chastised about, right? Solomon's saying it's okay to eat and drink and be happy in what you do, rejoice in what you do. Later on, we see a rich fool in the New Testament saying, eat, drink, and be merry, and his soul was required that night. But the focus was completely different. He was discarding God in looking at that rich fool. Solomon's saying it's just about this life. When you look at it from that lens, it's one of those things to enjoy the gift of what God has given us there too. So what did the author observe in verse 16 that left him so cynical? This is something that we see today even with two-tier justice, right? What we call two-tier justice. He said in the place of justice, there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness, there is wickedness. So there's inequities, and it's in the worst places. I mean, you've all probably dealt with somebody who's left the church because of hypocrites in the church. You know, I mean, there's the old saying on the church is, there's no one perfect church, and if you join it, it's no longer perfect. You know, kind of. So, you know, it's life in general in some of these things. It's where we see in our government, where we see everything else too. So, how do we know the breath of man ascends upward? All right. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ showed us those things. So there's a question on there too. What's your unjust disadvantage? That's some things that we need to look at internally on that. But the message is, hold on. This life is going to be rough. It's going to take you all over the place, but it's not about the here and now. We got to keep the vertical viewpoint. That's what we got to focus on. So thanks for your good attention. We'll see you in chapter 4 on Sunday night.